Audience discretion is advised due to potentially distressing and sensitive material. Kathy was born on August 6, 1968, and was a bright, kind, and promising young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. Granted, she had quit school and didn't have a clue as to what she wanted to do in the future. But as for now, she was enjoying her life, her tight-knit family, and her community. Her parents, Thomas Bonney and Dorothy Mae Bonney, and her 5 siblings meant everything to her. They lived in Chesapeake, Virginia, and her dad ran an auto salvage yard. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was enough. They seemed like the perfect family to all their friends and family, and even their church. Things had become kind of tough for Kathy since she had left school though, but it wasn't anything she couldn't control. Her dad had become more strict and controlling, and this was to be expected because he doted on his kids and wanted the best for them. Quitting school was not in his daughter's best interest as far as Tom was concerned. He kept begging her, pleading with her to go back to school and make something of herself. But Kathy just wouldn't have it. She just thought life had much more to offer than just books and school. Dorothy did her best to calm the situation. After all, Kathy was 19 and she could do whatever she wanted. And even though her daughter was 19, Dorothy believed that they should support her decisions even if she was still living at home. Tom could see that Kathy had changed. He kept asking his wife Dorothy to get to the bottom of things and try to regain control of their daughter. But Dorothy resisted and said Kathy would come back to them and be their little girl if they only showed a little compassion and support. She told Tom that a car would make Kathy happy, and she could put some distance between herself and her family when things got too much for her to handle. But she left out the part about Kathy feeling so suffocated by her dad that she wanted to move out even though she didn't have a dime. So Tom, being the doting father that he was, gave in. On November 21st, 1987, Tom told Kathy that there was a truck for sale and they could go check it out if she wanted to. Kathy was so excited. She couldn't believe the words that were coming out of her father's mouth. You know what it's like getting your first car as a teenager. It was so unlike him to relinquish control over his daughter. But she thought maybe he's just realizing now that she's a grown woman. So the pair left the house around 7 p.m. to meet with the guy. His name was John, and they were supposed to meet at the 7-Eleven store. It was 2 hours later, around 9 p.m., when Tom came home without Kathy. He was out of breath and kept asking if anyone had seen Kathy. It was all very confusing. Didn't she live with you? Yes, she did, Tom said. But she went off with this guy John, who she turned out to know, and never came back. Tom had waited in the same spot for her for 2 hours, but she never showed, and there was no sign of the truck or John. He thought maybe Kathy was just too excited and had driven around and ended up at their own house, figuring her dad must have also headed home by that time. But no one had seen her since 7 when she walked out of the door with her dad. Tom was in absolute hysteria. He had no way of finding his daughter as there were no cell phones back then and it was nighttime already. How could he search for her? But Dorothy again tried to calm him down and said that she would be back and they should wait till tomorrow. If there is no sign of her by then they would alert the authorities. Tom calmed himself thinking about the one time that Kathy had stayed out all night without calling or checking in with anyone in the family. But Kathy's sister Susan couldn't wait until morning and went out to the 7-Eleven store to look for Kathy alone. The next morning, November 22nd, Tom and Dorothy reported Kathy missing to the Chesapeake Police Department, but because of her age, they couldn't start looking for her for 24 hours. Tom called the police again shortly before 7 p.m. and told them that Kathy was still missing, so an officer went down there right away to take an official statement. Tom told them what had happened, the test drive, the car, everything. By the next morning, the news of Kathy's disappearance had spread all over town, and everyone was praying for her safe return. No one could believe this could have happened to such a sweet girl and in such a small town. Where could she be? Had the guy really kidnapped her? Then why hadn't he asked for a ransom? Even if she was kidnapped, everyone knew that Tom and Dorothy didn't have much. On the same day, November 22nd, at around 3 p.m., a fisherman was walking down the dismal swamp canal when he saw something floating on the water. At first, he didn't know what he was looking at. He couldn't make it out. But when he got closer, he saw it. It was the nude body of a female. He alerted the police and they were on the scene within 15 minutes. Since Kathy had gone missing just a day ago, an officer grabs her driver's license from the family house and heads for the crime scene. It was obvious that this was no suicide or accident. It was a brutal murder. There were numerous wounds and scratch marks on the body, and there were bullet holes on her limbs and her face. There was a bloody footprint or palm print in the middle of the victim's chest. She was missing front teeth. There were marks on the wrist similar to those left by handcuffs. The body was dumped like it was nothing. She was so badly disfigured that she was beyond recognition, so the driver's license didn't really come in handy. Next, what they could do was to ask the parents to identify the body. But when they called Tom to talk about what had happened, he said it was too late and they had to drop by the next morning. So the detective drops by the yard where Tom worked the next morning. They get to talking and Tom reveals that Kathy had been dating John Hoskins, one of his former employees who he had fired 10 days earlier. He also added that he had searched Kathy's room for some sort of clue, see if she had just run away or something, when he had come across a letter in her diary. He was shocked to see that it was very vulgar and seductive, and in it she had written about an affair with a married man and a previous sexual relationship. Anyway, they took a photo of the dead body that was found to Kathy's parents so they could identify the body. When they showed them the picture, Tom and Dorothy are terrified to look. Dorothy closes her eyes and Tom starts crying without even seeing the photo. But life isn't always fair and Tom just knew he had to do it no matter how much he didn't want to. He finally musters up all the courage he can and opens his eyes. But then he says that it's not Kathy and asks Dorothy to look at the photo. They both start crying tears of happiness and wish the dead girl's parents peace. On Wednesday, November 25, 1987, the body of the victim was identified as that of Kathy Bonney by matching the fingerprints with those obtained from her room. By the time her autopsy was completed, it was reported that there was a total of 27 gunshot wounds to Kathy's head, torso, and legs, some of which had been inflicted after death. Dr. Harris, who conducted the autopsy, noted that 2 of the gunshot wounds over the left forehead were inflicted from close range and were close together. Both had entered the brain cavity. 6 of the gunshot wounds to Kathy's face were fired from some distance. 1 of the 6 broke teeth in the upper jaw. 3 gunshot wounds were to the neck and had traveled upwards to her brain. There were 10 gunshot wounds to the chest and 6 to the lower legs. In his opinion, 4 or 5 of the gunshot wounds were made after death. He also noted that the gunshots to the chest occurred prior to her death and she had died 2 to 3 minutes after the wounds had been inflicted. The 2 gunshots to the head, the 8 in the face and the 10 to the chest, were inflicted before death, and the ones to the legs after death. In an extremely sad and unsettling way, the good news is that the wounds to the face and head would have rendered Kathy unconscious almost immediately, and she wouldn't have felt the pain of the rest of the gunshots. But what is torturous to know is that the evidence showed the murder involved psychological torture, and the murderer had stopped to reload the weapon at least twice while shooting her. This evidence tended to show Kathy was alive and aware of her fate while many of the shots were being fired into her. The detective drives back to Tom and Dorothy's house to break their hearts into a million pieces for the second time that week. When he tells them that the body was positively identified as their eldest daughter, Tom starts yelling and falls to the floor. Dorothy had to hold him for a long time to calm him down and bring him back to reality. His condition was so severe that paramedics had to be called to assist. The week after, Tom and Dorothy had to go down to the station to view some more photographs and answer some questions. While narrating what had happened on November 21st, the night Kathy had gone missing, Tom said that he had driven over to the 7-Eleven store with Kathy in the passenger seat in his Chevrolet. The detective frowns and takes another look at his notes. Next, the detective asks him if he owns a 9-shot .22 revolver. Tom replies that he used to have one, but he had sold it to a black man whose name he couldn't recall. The detective takes another look at his notes. Then he looks Tom straight in the eye and asks, "Did you kill your daughter, Tom?" This was the breaking point for Tom. He starts repeatedly saying that he was wrong to think that, and the photograph of the dead body was not Kathy's. It was some other girl's photo. The reason why the police had grown suspicious of him was that Tom kept changing his story. He first has stated that he had driven his record to meet the guy named John, but then he said it was his Chevrolet. He had also stated that someone had stolen his gun, but then he said that he had sold it to a black guy. These inconsistencies had changed the course of the investigation. In December 1987, Susan Bonney, Kathy's sister, told the police that she had seen bloodstains in her father's car on the night Kathy disappeared, when she left to go look for her sister at the store. She was afraid of her father and described him as an extremely controlling and strict father who wouldn't let his children even date. Now imagine that this is a small town and news and gossip spread like wildfire. Well, needless to say that everyone was talking about Tom killing his daughter, and even his own children and wife were scared of him. Dorothy tried to have faith even though social services took away her children after this whole thing about Tom killing Kathy blew up. But at the same time, the investigation was ongoing and the police were doing everything possible to find out the truth. After Susan's interview, the police searched the Chevrolet and found traces of Kathy's hair in the rear and trunk of the car. But at this discovery, Tom Bonney took off. Later, he was apprehended on January 31st, 1988, and was taken to North Carolina. Tom said that on Friday, November 20th, 1987, he had found copies of the letter Kathy had written to John Hoskins, and he confronted her with the letter the next day when he was supposed to be taking her to test drive a car. They were sitting in the Chevrolet parked on the sideway of Highway 17. Contrary to what Tom expected, Kathy did not show any remorse or apologize for her actions. She instead started yelling at him, saying that he was so controlling that it embarrassed her, and she also called him a bunch of names, at which Tom just lost it. He said Kathy had lunged for the gun and it just went off. When asked if he had in fact shot Kathy, because it was 27 gunshots and not just one accidental one, he said he started shooting her while they were in the parked car. But then something snapped in his head and he started shooting her several times. He then admitted that he had removed Kathy's clothes and that he had taken extra bullets with him on the night of November 21st. Because of the nature of his interviews, Dr. Paul Dell, a psychologist, began a series of interviews with him and diagnosed him with dissociative identity disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and mixed personality disorder, and this was all the result of the psychological trauma Tom had experienced at the death of his maternal grandmother and the abuse he had gone through by the hands of his own father. Apparently, Kathy had used the same exact words to refer to him as Tom's father had, and that is what made him snap. So, using hypnosis, Dell identified 10 separate personalities in Bonney: Tom, the host personality, Satan, Mamie, Damien, Viking, Tommy, Hitman, Preacher, Dad, and Kathy, each of which had their own function and enabled Tom to cope with the trauma he had experienced. And Damien was a personality that had murdered his daughter. The interviews were all recorded and presented to the court as evidence. In one of them, he even claims that Kathy is still alive and visits him every night in his cell. According to Dr. Dell, Tom was incapable of understanding his actions and distinguishing between right and wrong. He was simply mentally ill. But Dr. Philip Kuntz, the psychologist appointed by the prosecution, reviewed 13 hours of the video footage and stated that Dr. Dell had asked Tom leading questions and suggested to Tom that he might have other personalities while Tom was under hypnosis, from which he concluded that Tom was well aware of the difference between right and wrong and had willingly murdered his daughter because he thought he was losing control over her. The defense tried to portray him as a loving, doting father who simply had a mental illness and wasn't aware of what he was doing. John McClung, who was a former business partner of Tom's and had known him for about 14 years and was also friends with Kathy, said on the stand that Tom had a poor memory and abrupt mood swings when it came to the Bible and religion. Tom's wife Dorothy admitted to hearing him talk to someone who wasn't in the room on multiple occasions, or becoming like a little boy with a little boy's voice when he played with his younger son. Mr. McClung also added that Tom hadn't been acting normal or like one in his right mind days leading to the murder. The jury found Tom Bonney guilty of first-degree murder on November 25, 1988, and sentenced him to death on November 30th. But Tom appealed the verdict, and the court found that the jury in the original trial had been improperly instructed in its consideration of the capital punishment, so there was a new jury to only fix the punishment. At the hearing, Tom was again said to be unfit to stand trial as there was an outburst on his part and the judge had to declare a mistrial. But he was eventually sentenced to life in prison on October 16, 2007. Interestingly, Tom made his first escape attempt during his first trial when he jumped from the car he was transported in and ran 50 feet while still handcuffed before he was caught again. In 1994, he again escaped with a fellow inmate through a trash compacting chute and hid in the garbage truck. It was first speculated that the pair had been crushed to death, but the two had stolen a car and driven to Hampton Beach. Tom was apprehended 4 days later without any resistance and stated that he only had escaped to visit his mother's grave, who had died while he was on death row and couldn't attend her funeral, and the grave of Kathy, and that he would have turned himself in even if he wasn't caught because he needed food and medication. But why? Why would a father kill his own daughter? What would you do if the person you trusted most, the person who swore to protect you, was the very one who took everything from you? Our thoughts and prayers go out to all those affected by this crime. May Kathy's beautiful soul rest in peace. Please leave any theories or comments you might have for us down below. We're really interested to know what you think about this case.